Hello, good evening. We are going to give just a couple more minutes for people to finish logging in, even though it is 6 o'clock now, and then we'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. All right, good evening, everybody. It is my pleasure to, on behalf of the Ontario Municipal Utilities Company, as well as my agency, the Waterwise Community Center, welcome you to our cool season vegetable gardening class. My name is Scott Kleinerock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center, and I will be your presenter this evening. So, a couple of quick notes before we get into the presentation. If you want to take notes during this presentation, that's great, but you don't need to worry about getting down every little last detail. And in fact, some of the slides I'm going to show you are more like references where there'll be lists of different crops and planting spacings and all that sort of stuff, which is just, you're not going to be able to write it all down. So if you would like to go back and refer back to these slides as a reference, you can download a PDF file, a single file that has all of the slides, one slide per page, from our website. I will have that up by midday tomorrow afternoon. I made some final changes on this afternoon. So I will get that up by midday tomorrow. And you will be able to do that at this link down here at the bottom, cbwcd.org/presentations. That's cbwcd.org/presentations. And if you go there, it will bring you basically just to a list of links to all of the presentations that the Waterwise Community Center has hosted lately. And you can right click on the Cool Season Vegetable Gardening link, and you will be able to save that file. They're always posted in order of the most recent one at the top. So by tomorrow afternoon, the Cool Season Vegetable Gardening link will be right there at the top if you want to download that file. We are also recording this presentation tonight, and after some light editing, by midweek next week, you will be able to rewatch this presentation on our YouTube channel in our workshops playlist. And if you go to this upper link, cbwcd.org/YouTube, that's cbwcd.org/YouTube, you will be able to rewatch this whole presentation. Before we jump into it, I want to tell you just a little bit about the agency that I am from and what we do. We call ourselves the Waterwise Community Center, and our formal agency name is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We are a special district, so kind of similar to like a school district or a fire district, but our district exists specifically for water conservation purposes, large and small. We are created by a public vote all the way back in 1949. And essentially, we exist to protect and help steward our local groundwater basin, which is called the Chino groundwater basin. And so even though you're in Ontario, even though our headquarters is physically located in Montclair, The main groundwater basin that serves the western edge of San Bernardino County, which is my agency's service area, is called the Chino groundwater basin. And that provides about 60% of the water supply to our local area. That is a huge resource. Most communities in Southern California do not have that resource. And that is the reason why, for example, even though our water bills personally might not feel inexpensive, we pay much, much less for water here than, for example, people in Los Angeles do, who don't have that huge groundwater resource right underneath their community. And so we say our mission is threefold: to percolate, demonstrate, and educate. In terms of percolation, we work at the very large scale, owning and operating in coordination with other water agencies a series of large scale, what we call infiltration basins. So if you've seen some of those big holes to the north and south of the 10 freeway that sometimes fill up with water, those are actually some of our infiltration basin properties. Most of them are literally old gravel pits, which have been re-engineered and reconfigured to take in stormwater when it rains that would otherwise leave our communities, as well as some of them recycled and imported water when it's available. And we manage that to, using natural processes, clean and then recharge our local groundwater basin. So we have it for later use to be pumped up by wells and go into our local water supply by your water providers. And that's how we work on the supply side of water conservation. But we also know that if that water is then being pumped up and brought to us and cleaned, but we're not using it wisely on the demand side, we're missing part of that water conservation puzzle. And so to that end, we are here to demonstrate and educate. We have a free public demonstration garden of a few acres of water-wise plants, showing lots of different plants, lots of different approaches you can take to have beautiful, lush, colorful water-wise gardens. Doesn't need to be all gravel and a few cactus. And that is at our headquarters facility in Montclair, called the Waterwise Community Center, open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. for free 6 days of the week. Currently, our inside office building is closed, but you can go from the park next to our parking lot right into our demonstration gardens. And so we hope you come visit us. And then we also do lots of education for all sorts of different age groups and community groups. So that's everything from curriculum integrated K through 12 field trips to free workshops online like this. Most of the time we do in-person workshops in Montclair, and in the new year, we are looking forward to getting transitioning back from being all online, which we have been lately, to also integrating kind of hands-on workshops out in our demonstration garden. And we also do training for landscape professionals. If you're interested in learning more about this, as well as many other programs, including some of them that as Ontario residents, you qualify for one-on-one with getting some support to understanding your home irrigation system, knowing if your sprinklers should be set differently to water more efficiently, or even getting help with redesigning your yard to be a water-wise landscape, we have programs that are of no cost that can help you out. And the best way to keep in touch with everything that we are doing is to sign up for our monthly newsletter, which you can do easily at cbwcd.org/newsletter. And I'm going to type that into the chat right now, cbwcd.org/newsletter. And we don't share your email address with anybody else. All we do is send you one email a month with all of our updates. And you can also, just by typing into Google, either Chino Basin Water Conservation District or Waterwise Community Center, you can find our main website and learn all about who we are and what we do. Amy from the Ontario Municipal Utilities Company, who will be joining us in a little while, but wasn't able to be here at the beginning of the workshop, asked me to share this with you as well. She is the water conservation coordinator there. She is the one who coordinated with me to offer this workshop this evening. And they also have a number of incentives and rebates that you all qualify for. One of the coolest ones, and we'll talk a little bit about this later in the context of vegetable gardens, but really for your whole landscape, is if you have an existing irrigation controller, so the little box, usually it's in your garage, that tells your sprinklers when to turn on and off, you can qualify for a free upgrade to what's called a smart controller, which is something that a professional landscape contractor would come in and install for you as well, completely for free. And that smart controller will actually automatically adjust based on the weather. So basically, it gets set up just for the peak of summer, and then it automatically knows if it's cooler, it's going to water a little bit less. So it can help you save a lot of water, whether it's for watering your lawn, watering your fruit trees, or also if there's a valve that waters your vegetable garden. And so there are some details related to that, but you can find out the information at this website link here, OntarioWaterWise.com, to get the full details. And they have one that's really cool that they install. It happens to be the one that we use both at the WaterWise Community Center and I use at my house, which is one that if your home Wi-Fi system can reach in that area, you can actually access everything, change all the settings from either a laptop computer or a computer at home or from your cell phone. And it makes it much more intuitive to do all of that work. And once again, that is completely at no cost to you because it could potentially help you save water. And then in addition, there are water conservation rebates that you can qualify for through a different website, which is SoCalWatersmart.com. And that's where you would go for things like rebates on high efficiency toilets, washing machines, if you want to buy and install your own smart irrigation controller. And as well, there are currently rebates available to remove a lawn if you have a lawn or remove part of your lawn. And with meeting some very specific qualifications, you can install WaterWise plants as well as something like a dry stream bed, something to capture some of the rainwater when it rains, and receive a $3 per square foot rebate to help pay for that work. Normally, if you're doing that sort of landscaping work by yourself as a DIY project, that can pretty much cover the cost. It normally won't cover the cost of hiring a contractor to do it, but might make a significant contribution. So that's the turf replacement rebate. If you're interested in learning more about the process of landscape transformation, as well as more about the turf replacement rebate, you can join us for another class that we teach once a month in the evening at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, just directly through the WaterWise Community Center, which is called Landscape Transformation Basics. We are going to be teaching it again in November. I believe it's the 14th or the 18th. I don't remember the date off the top of my head, but you can find out about that as well as a whole bunch of other free workshops that we have coming up at the link I'm about to type into the chat right now as well at cbwcd.org/waterwise workshops. And that'll take you to our page on Eventbrite, where you can see all of our free workshop listings and actually sign up for them there. And so with all of that, let's get into the actual content, getting to talking about cool season vegetable growing. I briefly want to introduce myself in terms of who I am and why I'm even talking to you about this. So for those of you who are at the beginning, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the WaterWise Community Center, but I also happen to be an avid vegetable gardener, as well as grow fruit trees. And I also grow a lot of California native plants at home. And in fact, learning how to grow my own food is what first brought me into horticulture in the plant world many years ago. I've done that both kind of professionally. I spent a number of years kind of designing, setting up, and then operating an urban agriculture demonstration garden at a botanical garden, where I got to do a lot of experiments and really kind of refine my techniques. I've also been an avid home gardener in all sorts of situations, from only having room to garden in containers, to doing gardening in rental situations, to finally having my own home where I can have lots of in-ground vegetable gardens. And I've learned a lot along the way. So this class is basically going to be a lot of my top advice to really make the difference between sticking some things in the ground and hoping for the best and success, to kind of the major factors that I've found, which really make the difference to where my partner and I are at today, which is we grow not every single vegetable crop, but of the crops we do grow, we normally end up growing way more than we can eat and end up having plenty to share with neighbors, family, and also dropping things off in peak harvest season at our local food bank. And so a lot of these tips today, this content is going to be those little things that make the difference in terms of really getting that abundant harvest. And so that's a little bit about me. The last thing we are going to do before we totally jump into it is you are going to tell me quickly just a little bit about you, and that will also help me tailor what we talk about this evening to what you are trying to accomplish in your vegetable garden. So you saw this poll open in your Zoom interface, and please just quickly, because we have a lot to cover, click the relevant answers. Some of it gives us our metrics just for kind of tracking this, but then at the end, there's a couple of questions about whether or not you currently grow vegetables at home, and then if so, kind of how much you are hoping to grow. And that will really help me with what I emphasize or spend more time on with our content this evening. Cool. Some people are starting to finish. We'll give it just another minute or so. Thank you very much. So far, it is looking like most of you do some vegetable gardening at home. Wait for the last couple of people to finish. Some of you grow in containers. Some have a couple of raised beds, and some have more than a couple of raised beds, but not a huge area. Awesome. And then one person is just getting started. So that's cool. This workshop is for all of you. Sorry, I need to close that. There's a little bug in Zoom. Whenever I touch the poll thing, it kind of crashes. So this brings me to how to ask me questions this evening, and also asking for just a little bit more feedback. So to ask questions this evening, we don't have people raise their hands and call on them and have them unmute their microphones, because we find that there's a lot of downtime with that. And so the best way to ask me questions, and you can do that at any point in time as I go, is to type your questions into the little Q&A function in your Zoom window. So in your Zoom kind of little panel where there's the different buttons you can press, there's one that says Q&A and has two little text bubbles. That's the one to type in. That goes into a different window than the chat, and that really lets me track questions. And then when I'm kind of stopping in between different topics and I see questions that have come in, that lets me very easily stop and make sure that I answered them all. If you have comments at any point in time, you can feel free to type that into the chat function, which will open another different little window. And then finally, the one follow-up question I have, a number of people attending said that they currently grow in containers. It would be useful for me to hear if, for those of you who are growing in containers, are you growing in containers because that's how you have to grow? And I've definitely been there before, and that works. Like you're in a rental situation and you don't have any room to grow in the ground, or you only have a concrete patio, or do you potentially have the ability to also move into growing stuff in the ground or in raised beds? That would be super useful, because that could help me know how much time to emphasize growing food in containers or not. And so with that, we're going to jump into it. With where do you start? With vegetable gardening, the most important thing that I always tell people to think about before they jump into it is to think about what your goals are and consider your expectations. Are you in it mostly for the experience of growing food? Are you in it to try to grow food economically, to try to save some money? That would definitely mean that you need to be very careful about what you are doing. If you're growing for economics, you can't spend $300 on materials for a raised bed. It doesn't need to cost that much. And you would be better doing the best you can to grow economically in the ground. If it's just for the experience, that doesn't matter as much. If you're growing for top quality produce, you're really going to need to think a lot about soil quality, or a combination of them. Also think about how many hours a week you want to spend in your garden. 1 or 2 raised beds doesn't need to take a lot of time, but you don't want to spend hours and hours first growing and then harvesting, which can take a long time. Don't plant an enormous vegetable garden. For most people, I would recommend starting, if you have the space, with 1 or 2 4 foot wide by 8 foot long raised beds, and we're going to see a lot of those, or in the ground. And in Ontario, you tend to have a lot of really, really good soil. Maybe there's sometimes weeds, maybe it's dried out, but you have generally good stuff that with some moisture, some amendment, some weed control, you can actually have better soil in the ground in most of Ontario than any soil that you can buy to put in a raised bed. And then also remember, when you think about setting your goals and considering your expectations, that you will always have to pay your taxes to the wild world, which means if you are growing, some amount of what you grow is going to get eaten by squirrels, birds, whatever. Happens to commercial growers as well, can be very heartbreaking as a home gardener. But I would say off the top, at least 30, if not 40% of what you grow, just expect that you're going to kind of lose it along the way. And that's totally typical. And then if you do better than that, which sometimes you might, then you're going to be very happy. But understand that, we are part of a larger ecosystem, and the critters are going to get some of it as well. Important thing about setting expectations. Okay, thank you for the feedback. And so a number of people growing in containers could potentially grow some in the ground with some weed control, or maybe some refined tips and techniques. So that's very useful. And so whether or not you are in containers or growing in the ground, one of the most important things is make sure to set up yourself up for success by selecting the best site possible. And a lot of people who I work with sometimes are thinking, well, this is the most convenient place to plant my veggies, but sometimes that's on the north side of the house where there's just not enough sun. And so to grow the greatest, have the most options for what vegetables you can grow, you want to have an area that's full sun. And that doesn't necessarily need to mean full blasting sun from sunup and sundown. Literally, full sun is defined as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight a day. So if it gets a little bit of shade in the morning from the house, or in our hot summers, an area that gets a little bit of afternoon shade, either from the house or from a tree, that can be fine. That can actually be preferable, as long as you get 6 or more hours of direct sunlight pretty much throughout the year or throughout the season that you're growing. That afternoon shade can be okay, and you can still have an area that's considered full sun. And then pay attention to the different times of year. So now, as we're kind of in mid-fall, that's actually a decent time to be looking at it. Sometimes it's hard to look at that in the summer, because even on the north side of a house or the north side of a garage, which is very shady all winter and much of the spring and fall, is still going to be full sun looking in the summer. So generally, the south side of a house or garage, or the east or west side could potentially work, but not the north side. Also, avoid growing, unless you're growing in containers, near large trees whose roots will constantly be growing into your vegetable beds, or if you're growing in the ground directly, whose roots you would have to be disturbing and kind of breaking to kind of dig your bed. You also generally want to make sure that you have good drainage. Now, I'm going to assume that all of you are in Ontario this evening. And the good thing is that you naturally have some of the best soil around and generally drains pretty well. The only exception to that, for the most part in Ontario, would be if there's heavy compaction. So if you happen to live in a newer construction house where there kind of was built in 1990s, definitely in the 2000s, where the construction techniques changed and kind of was huge tractors would flatten the whole area, and then houses would be built, generally small yards, you might have kind of more compaction. Or if, like, for example, it's an area that's dirt where there's been like a car parking for the last number of years. If that's the case, you might need to loosen the soil pretty deeply. Generally, if you're wondering if you have good drainage or not, you can dig a hole in the ground about 1 foot by 1 foot, fill it with water a couple of times and let it drain out, just to make sure all the soil around it is wet, and then fill it with water a third time and time how fast the water drains. If on average your drainage is 2 inches per hour or more, get out there with a measuring tape and kind of measure it, then you have good drainage and you'll be fine with that. If you have bad drainage, you either need to dig deeply, or you can work in raised beds, which will at least get good drainage to the most important, top foot or so of the soil where most of your vegetable roots will be. And then also the last thing to think about is site it in a place that's going to work for you, a place that you'll want to spend time in, and then also a place that you'll see enough if you have a large yard and you'll remember to do your harvesting. Because surprisingly, one of the things that's the hardest for kind of casual vegetable gardeners to find the time and remember to do is actually doing the harvesting. Sometimes, people will get through the part of growing and they just won't get out there and do the harvesting. So put it in a place where you're going to get out there and actually do it. Moving on, you're also going to want to think some about garden layout. And don't worry, it's not all going to be text. We are rapidly going to move into seeing lots of photos. So for garden layout, have planting beds that are going to be a practical size for you. Sometimes people, when they're digging vegetable beds or they're laying it out, think, oh, I only need like a foot of space to kind of sneak in between my vegetable beds. You're going to want more space than that. In general, if you're working with like a standard size raised bed, at minimum 2, better 3 feet of space in between your vegetable beds. Because if your crops do really well, they are going to grow beyond the edges of your bed, and leaving yourself space to move around, to do your harvesting and not have to trample your plants as you work around them is going to be very useful. And within your beds, whatever amount of space you have, don't try to cram in too many plants. That's a typical kind of beginner move that I see. You end up spending way more money on plants and seeds than you need to. And then the plants compete with each other and you don't get as large of a harvest. Sometimes you have more disease pressure because there's less air circulation and the maintenance is trickier. And so I will provide you with recommendations for spacing later on. And if you're thinking about laying out your beds, you can always kind of sketch out in your landscape where your beds are going to be and make sure that feels comfortable. One of my favorite things to do, for example, is if I was thinking about like this raised bed situation, before I actually build them, I might get out here with like a bag of flour and just kind of chalk out with that flour, sprinkling where things would be, where the gap would be, make sure I can kind of reach and make sure that it looks all right, because it's easy to modify your plans before you actually build it. After you build it, it's quite a bit tougher. And so just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is generally what I'm talking about when we talk about raised beds. Generally, it's a wood frame. Might be a little bit raised, might be a lot of bit raised. And we'll talk about pros and cons of raised beds in a moment. This is typically what I'm talking about. This is a larger garden and a place that I used to work. But this is typically what I'm talking about if I'm talking about in-ground beds. You might not have this large of a space, but we're talking about working with the soil that's there in your yard. Again, in Ontario, you normally have pretty great soil. Maybe you need some compost, get some moisture down in there, but the stuff of it is a beautiful sandy loam soil. Part of why there was so much agriculture historically in Ontario. And so this is generally kind of what I'm talking about. Doesn't need to be, but normally for convenience sake and for the ability to irrigate it, they're kind of long rows. I am a fan of the 3 to 4 foot wide in-ground bed within a nice path in the middle. And so when you think about your garden layout, in most cases, you're going to want to plan for 3 feet to 4 foot wide in-ground beds, depending on your reach. And a raised bed, oftentimes you can reach, even if it's just like a foot tall, you can reach farther into a raised bed. So a 4 foot wide raised bed is pretty standard. Remember to go with that path space. And then in your path areas in between, it's really a good idea to do something to prevent the weeds from growing. Just a wood chip mulch works really well. We give away a similar wood chip mulch to this in our parking lot here at the Waterwise Community Center in Montclair. You can come anytime. There's just a big pile in our parking lot that we work with a local arborist company that grinds up all of the stuff, and they donate it to us for free so we can share with the community, or you can buy it at local landscape supply stores. And if you happen to come and get it for free from us, you just bring your own containers and your tools, fill up as much as you need, and enjoy it. So that's the stuff that I use at my home. In between my vegetable beds is the stuff in our parking lot. And then if you happen to have weeds that would be coming up, you can always put down, instead of needing to do like that black plastic weed barrier that you get in rolls at the hardware store, that causes problems over time and just turns into plastic trash in the landscape. You can always put down some recycled corrugated cardboard boxes just as a temporary weed barrier before you put down your mulch. And that will generally last, depending on the amount of moisture in the soil, 6 months to a year, and will generally smother most of the weeds. And then if you keep it mulched with wood chips, just touch up every once in a while after that, that helps quite a bit with not needing to do as much weeding in your pathways. If you do have like true turf, you're going to want to remove that turf first and then follow up with that cardboard mulch in the pathways. And so let's talk a little bit about where you might even want to grow. Raised beds versus in the ground beds versus containers. Everything has pros and cons. There's no perfect system. In ground beds in your kind of valley bottom areas like Ontario have better soil potential, and it's going to be much, much, much more economical to establish and maintain between the wood and the soil fill and the organic kind of compost materials. You end up spending quite a bit of money. It's typical 4x8 foot raised bed. It's going to be at least $100. And that could be worth it in the long run if that's what you have. But if you're trying to do this economically, with your in-ground soil, you can start with just getting some compost and digging. And especially if you're going to be hand watering, there's not that much that you need to buy. Raised beds are great for areas with heavy clay, mostly rock. If you have lots of gophers, you can build a raised bed and put hardware cloth underneath, which is that square pattern, kind of like a thicker than chicken wire that you can get at the hardware store. And that could help a lot. Or if you want a really efficient harvest of small plants. So for example, at my house in Pomona, which has some of our soil similar to Ontario, but with a lot more rock and gravel in it still, but decent enough. In our main vegetable bed area, we just dug out as much rock and gravel as we can, and we end up with pretty good stuff in our in-ground beds. But we also grow some like small salad greens that we cut when they're small, especially in the winter, and kind of fancier salad greens. We built raised beds for those because it's a lot easier to harvest with it being a little bit raised than being down on our hands and knees for a long time harvesting fussy little salad greens on the ground. That being said, though, it took a lot longer and a lot more work to make our soil that we purchased, even though it was supposed to be good soil in our raised beds, as good as our soil in the grounds. Because even when you purchase amended soil for your raised beds from the landscape supply yards, basically they're using soil that has come from construction sites, and they add some compost and things like that, but it's not going to be as good as your natural topsoil in most cases. Raised beds are also really good for people with back problems or mobility restrictions. So for example, when I built a raised bed, or when I built a vegetable bed for my parents, my mom has a back issue. So I built a raised bed for her. It is much easier for her to work and harvest than if she had to get down on the ground. That just wouldn't be happening for her. And then finally, containers are good for a couple of things. For the most part, for vegetables, I'd say go with them if those are your only option. You have to do a lot more watering to keep containers going. You generally, it's a lot harder to reuse the soil year after year in containers because they contain the root mass gets very dense, where in raised beds or in the ground beds, you never need to worry about just wholesale replacing your soil. However, if that's your only option, it can totally work. And for example, one thing that really works well for me in containers is what you see here. This is an example. I'll show you some other pictures from this garden that I had, where a place that my partner and I had rented, our only really good full sun area was on a big concrete driveway. And this concrete area was kind of immediately next to the driveway. And so we built extra tall raised beds right on top of the concrete. And then outside the door that kind of was the back door from the kitchen, we had these are 20-inch wide, kind of like the largest plastic pots you can get at the hardware store, with herbs in them. And those have lasted so long that we still, probably it's 6 years later now, at least 5 years, have brought them with us to the place that we live now, where we can garden in the ground, and they're still going. So we still have them right outside our kitchen. So herbs in containers can work very well. You literally just put one plant in there. It looks tiny at the beginning, but it's plenty of soil for them to be happy over time. And so again, in-ground beds, raised beds. So here, these are the ones that I built in my driveway. Normally, you absolutely would not need your raised beds to be this tall. My typical raised beds when I'm building them like over garden soil, even if it's compact or not that great, is just half of this. This is, for example, if you really have back problems and you would really want to get it as tall as possible, it could be worth it. In most cases, though, this just makes each bed twice as expensive as it needs to be to construct. But you can see you can get creative. So why it's so tall here is because these were just over concrete. The drainage wasn't going to be good. It was just going to drain a little bit out of the edges. So we knew that there'd be a kind of mucky layer in the bottom. And so we wanted to make sure we had plenty of good soil on top of that. So we built them extra tall. And it worked out very well. Or here, this was just over a brick patio area. So here we made it lower because we knew that we had better drainage. And then over here, we actually had room in the ground. And so we just grew in the ground there. So some examples. Here's other examples. Front yard, this is locally, I can't remember if this is Pomona or Claremont, but locally in our area. So they kind of mixed it into a kind of desert landscape. So you can put them where you want them. Here's another front yard. This is a picture I took in Claremont where you can see nice pathways, some dwarf fruit trees. And then on the other side, there were some native plants, and then just mixing in, one vegetable bed, doing very well. If you are only going to be growing in containers, the most economical way that I ever figured out to grow in containers, and this is kind of a ridiculous number of containers, but this was actually an experiment that I did. I was trying to figure out, could it be economically viable in terms of like trying to actually grow more value of produce than it takes to buy all of the stuff. Could that be economically done in containers? And what I figured out is if you're very careful on what you spend on setting it up, yes. And the most efficient way that I figured out how to do it is taking 18 or 20 gallon storage tubs, drilling holes in the bottom for drainage, and then filling them with potting soil, and then being very careful about what I chose to grow. So growing leafy greens where you don't need to harvest the whole plant at once, but you can cut the outer leaves and keep coming back was very productive. You could grow a single like zucchini or a single tomato in the summer, and that would work, but not as well as kind of focusing on growing greens and herbs. If you are going to grow in a raised bed, I have a strong recommendation for how to build it. Most of the raised beds that you saw, or all the raised beds that you saw so far, are not like this. This is something I discovered a couple of years ago, and I have become a convert. At both of our local big box hardware stores, at Lowe's or Home Depot, in the outdoor section where they have like pavers and cinder blocks, they sell what are called planter wall blocks. And they cost, you can check, sometimes the price shifts, but $2.50 to $3 each. And basically they're made out of concrete. And here's what you can do with them. So instead of needing to do carpentry work, instead of needing to find bolts or screws and really work that together and try to square everything up as you build your raised beds and then worry about the wood warping and maybe popping off those screws, basically you can stack these up. If you want a roughly 1 foot tall bed, you would do 2 of these. If you want a little bit taller, you can do 3 in the corners. And that also sets you up to square them up pretty nicely. And then you just get 2x6 lumber and you just slide them into the slots. It's super simple. It's super quick. It's very sturdy. And then the one thing to just remember, for example, is if you want a 4 foot wide bed, because there's a little bit of width here, you're going to need to have the wood cut the wood just a little bit less wide. And the hardware store will even make the cuts for you. So normally what you can do is you can get for each level or each tier of these, you can get 2 12-foot long 2x6s and then have them cut down with just 1 or 2 cuts. And they will do that at the store for you. So you don't even need to have the tools yourself. You just slide it all together. If you want to really secure the edges before it gets filled, there's also a center hole where you can pound in a stick of rebar, which you can also get at the hardware store, to super secure the ends. So I've totally become a convert. It's just so easy, and it's actually more durable. And then the lumber, the 2x6 lumber, is cheaper than the 2x12 lumber that traditionally most people would use for the raised beds. If you're interested in learning more about the actual raised bed construction, getting really deep into the soils, and then kind of step by step putting together irrigation systems for raised beds, we actually have a whole workshop that we teach about that, and an online recording of that as well. And so I'm going to type in, I mentioned it earlier, it's the same YouTube channel where you can watch that. It's cbwcd.org/YouTube. And it's going to be, it's something like DIY raised bed construction and vegetable gardening. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on that because we need to get to like the cool season vegetable gardening in this 2-hour class and talk about those crops and planting tips and all of that. Some people might see this and feel like, okay, you can go from there, but we get way more detailed. And I would recommend, if you are going to make the financial investment in building raised beds, definitely check out that online workshop recording. And so now we're going to talk about soils. Soils are mysterious to a lot of people. Some people say, oh, I don't have good soil, and they might have soil that has great potential. It just needs a little bit of work, whether that's a little bit of compost, slowly getting some moisture back into it. Soils are the most important thing probably for success with vegetable gardening. They're definitely the most important thing, in my opinion, between someone who kind of like casually grows a few vegetables and being really successful. And there's a few key concepts that you should understand about soil. The first one is that you don't want to have compacted soil. You want to have nice, loose soil. And so here is, just to kind of break down and explain it pretty quickly, beautiful agricultural soil or undisturbed natural soil in most areas is similar to what you see on the left, where basically, if you looked at it on a micro scale, by volume, only about half of the volume of, like, say, a cubic foot of that beautiful agricultural or undisturbed natural soil is going to be the actual stuff of soil. That's the mineral content, the sand, silt, and clay, or the organic matter, the compost type stuff. And half of that by volume is actually pore space. It's open space in between the little soil particles, which could either be filled with air or water or fluctuation. So it can fill up with water when it rains, or it gets watered, and then it can breathe and oxygen can get down to the roots. Often in urban areas, whether it's from construction or just from us stepping on it all the time, or from it being in lawn and, kids playing soccer on it for years or whatever, our soil is compacted. And in that case, our soil is at least 75% stuff, but it's often, you can see, like up to 80% that mineral matter. So what happens when that happens is you can see the space for air and the space for water shrinks down. And that's how, one of the main ways how you get to, that beautiful garden soil where you can water and it just sucks down that water, but it holds onto it and stays moist, versus you're watering and it's sliding off the top and the water doesn't absorb well. And not only that, but it's not going to hold on to water well. And the roots, which not only need water, but need oxygen, are not going to have as much access to it. So what we want to do is, if our soil is compacted, we want to, when we establish our beds, we want to dig and loosen it. And I'll show you some pictures of that process later on. And then after that, we don't want to step on our vegetable gardening soil. We want to stay standing in the pathways, and ideally never step in the soil, because that will keep that compaction from returning. And so here's just kind of showing the same thing. Again, just a kind of a graphic. You want more what's on the left and not what's on the right. And it matters. So this is from a experiment and a report that was done. This is corn, just as a representative crop, same exact conditions, but growing in low, medium, and high compaction soil. And you can see not only the top part, but look at that root system. That really matters. Not only does it matter just for the physical rooting of the plants, but the way our soils work and the way our plants get their nutrients is actually from a very complex little micro scale, some of it literally microscopic, whole ecosystem of little critters. And so in a organic soil system, so if you're not pouring synthetic pesticides or synthetic fertilizers into your soil, which in generally I recommend you avoid and use organic fertilizers, or even just in a completely natural system without any fertilizer, nutrients only become available to our plants after they've passed through what's called the soil food web. And what that means is that, like, for example, as like leaves break down or organic material breaks down and releases nutrients, that's generally not in a form directly available for our plant roots to absorb, but it needs to be eaten by little critters, maybe little fungal strands. Most soil fungus is beneficial. Bacteria, those are eaten by other little critters called nematodes. And basically, as those live and die and poop, what comes out of that are the actual nutrients available to our plants. Having that loose, well-structured, uncompacted soil allows all of this beneficial life to better do its job, which helps our plants thrive. And there's literally relationships in between all of these things. So our plant roots, it's really amazing. The root tips of our plants, which is that big thing here, it's a drawing of a root tip of a plant, actually will release sugars that the little microorganisms use because they can't produce their own sugars. Plants produce it with photosynthesis, but then in turn, they will share back other nutrients that are not directly available to the plant. But all those relationships happen much better in good, loose soil. Also, that doesn't overuse synthetic fertilizers. And that's why I always recommend using an organic fertilizer. There's plenty of good brands of organic fertilizers if you use it, if you're using fertilizer, and most gardeners will want to use some, and you just look for organic on the label. Other than that, I'm not really partial to any particular brand. Most nurseries and hardware stores sell decent brands. And basically, you don't need to understand all of this, but just understand that all of this stuff, all of this life, the reason why you don't want to compact your soil, the reason why you want to add some compost, I'll talk about other things to do later on for your soil or not to do, is because you want all of these interactions to be happening because it releases nutrients. And in general, most of this life is either beneficial or neutral for our plants. And what that means is if you have all of that, it also helps protect your plants from the bad guys. So for example, I love this picture. This is this main worm-looking thing in here. That is, for our plant's health at least, a bad guy. This is a root knot nematode. So it's a little critter that can cause our carrots to be all lumpy, can cause problems for some other vegetable plants. It's a common pest that you might need to deal with in a vegetable garden if your soil is kind of off or unbalanced, or sometimes it just happens. What's happening here is that this little strand through here is actually part of a soil fungus. And that soil fungus has these rings of cells that literally exude a compound that attracts these nematodes. And then when the nematode goes into it, these cells inflate and they trap it and it eats it. So there's this whole battlefield going on of different critters, things we would consider good guys, things we would consider bad guys. And if we don't have this balanced soil system, then the bad guys tend to be more aggressive. If we have this balanced soil system, oftentimes the critters are always going to be there, even the potential disease-causing organisms, but everything is more balanced. And so we're less likely to have problems that we need to deal with as gardeners. It's super complicated. Science is just learning more about it. But what we need to do as gardeners to embrace it is actually not complicated at all. And so we'll talk about some of those principles. And these are some of the most important things leading to really having great soil and kind of success. And so let's talk more about soils, compost, and soil amendments, because there's all sorts of stuff you can buy, and it gets pretty confusing for people. So what do we need to know to actually embrace what's called the soil food web, to have it working for us? For most of us, this means if we're gardening in the ground, loosening up the soil when we're first setting up our beds, relieving compaction. Even if you're going to be growing in raised beds over the ground, loosening up the soil some underneath it can definitely help some, allow your plants to root even deeper. It's also going to mean generally adding compost, and that's definitely going to be true for in-ground beds. And even with raised beds, the local soil companies that sell the soil you would put in raised beds, which we'll talk about some, I always add a little bit of compost as well, an inch or two, and mix it in when I'm getting going. And it might also mean to get this whole soil food web going again, if you have kind of desiccated, dry, or soil that you think is not great, might mean adding some of these beneficial microorganisms back in. Good thing is that most brands of organic fertilizer for our vegetables are going to have some of those beneficial microorganisms kind of in a dried out form in it. And so that's going to be included. But you can look at the label and some of them will say, with beneficial microorganisms or something like that. A very common brand that's available is Dr. Earth, definitely has that. Some of the other brands as well. And then when we talk about compost, the main kind of stuff to add that's not fertilizer, we'll look at pictures of compost in just a bit. Know that truly great compost, like the stuff you can make yourself if you're making your own compost in your backyard, is really hard to find. But there are local places that you can get. Sometimes they call it compost, sometimes they call it soil amendment, with good reputations, where you can get it kind of in bulk. And here is a list of some local areas where you can get it. There's a local farm in Ontario that produces its own compost called Amy's Farm. There is a vendor in Chino, a soil yard that sells compost. They also sell what it's called a 50-50 special mix for filling raised beds. It's 50% actual topsoil and 50% amendment. And that's generally what I would go with filling a raised bed. We also, twice a month at the Waterwise Community Center, do a compost giveaway. You can find information about that on our website. And then if you're going to be getting something that's in bags from the hardware store and not in bulk to add in, there's different brands and different things you can get. But basically things that say like raised bed planter mix or garden soil are what you can also mix in as a compost. Let's talk some about also nutrients and fertilizers. And it's going to get less complicated and more about plants, but these are some of the really kind of important things where people tend to be very confused about. So I definitely want to cover them. Nutrients and fertilizers. If you are going to be growing a very large garden that's going to supply a lot of your food, invest in a soil test to really make sure that your nutrients are high and balanced and that you don't have heavy metals in your soil. If you are working in containers or raised beds and bringing in your soil, generally you're not going to have to worry as much about that. If you are growing in the ground on an older property, if you're on, in Ontario and you're, have a house from like the 1920s or 1930s, you definitely want to do a soil test if you're going to be growing in the ground soil near the house, because lead paint was used back in the day. Or if you live right near the freeway, you want to do a soil test and make sure that you don't have lead soil and that lead will be accumulating in your plants. It can happen. So just make sure that things are going to be good and safe. And again, if you're doing raised beds, bringing in soil containers, generally don't need to worry about it. What most soil tests in terms of nutrients would show, I don't really push soil tests in our local area for nutrients because I've done a lot of them. And most of the time, what it will show is that we have really high good availability of most of the nutrients plants need, except for nitrogen, which is kind of what spurs growth. And so there's other nutrients that are important for other things, but our local soils just tend to be only low in nitrogen most of the time. And that's easily supplied by a little bit of organic fertilizer. And so when we look at our fertilizers, it can be very confusing. Even a modest nursery or definitely any hardware store will have tons and tons of fertilizer options. To keep things simple, you can't go wrong with most brands of just organic vegetable, or sometimes it's a vegetable and fruit tree fertilizer. You will see numbers on a fertilizer container. It will be sometimes, if it's a chemical fertilizer, it's going to be like 15, 15, 15. An organic fertilizer might be something closer to 4, 4, 4. And that's because the organic fertilizer is less potent, and that's a good thing. With the chemical fertilizers, you can apply too much and damage your plants. With the organic fertilizers, you can still get all the needed nutrients to your plants. You apply generally a little bit more in volume. The back of the package says, for however many square feet, apply this much. But with the organic fertilizers, because it's a more gentle action that needs to work its way through that whole soil food web, it's not the chemical that the plants can absorb right away. It's a good thing. It releases it slowly and sustained over time. It doesn't cause runoff problems or water pollution like the chemical fertilizers can. And because it's gentle and takes time to release, you can't generally damage your plants by overusing organic fertilizer. The three numbers, if you're interested, are in order called N, P, and K. So the first number is nitrogen. That's the one thing that we're often deficient in our soils. And that basically causes the plant to grow, the vegetative part, the green part of the plants to grow. Phosphorus is the second number. That stimulates roots as well as flowers and fruiting. And then the final one is potassium, which is overall plant performance and disease resistance. And normally our soils, again, are pretty good in phosphorus and potassium, but low in nitrogen. But any organic fertilizer that you get will be sufficiently supplied in all of them. Here are just three brands that are common to find: Down to Earth, Dr. Earth, and Kellogg, depending on which local nursery you go to. I will use any of them. Dr. Earth tends to have more of those beneficial microorganisms mixed in. So my first year, I'll generally use some of that. But then after that, Down to Earth tends to be a little bit cheaper, still has really good ingredients, doesn't have that soil biology added in. So generally, I will use that kind of ongoing for my main fertilizer. And then because the potency is a little bit different, you just look at the package and it tells you how much to apply, usually in like number of cups. And generally, once you get things going, it doesn't need to be a ton. Most of the time per season, so I'll consider like a summer season of things that I plant in the spring and then harvest in the summer through early fall. And then like right now for the cool season, it's time like right now to be starting to plant seeds or maybe transplant plants. I will fertilize right as I'm planting or right before I'm planting. And then about once halfway through the season is generally all you'll need to do. And the next thing we're going to talk about is, okay, then what do? We talked about soil. We talked about compost. How do you do all of this stuff? And I think I'm going to skip kind of over this slide because I want to make sure that we get to more details about the veggies themselves. This is a shorter version of a longer workshop that I do. But basically, the big difference is whether or not you dig up your soil every year and loosen things. And the traditional way of gardening is every single season, in between the seasons, you get out there with the shovel or with the digging fork and you turn the soil over and you dig it all up and you loosen all up again. Or you get out there with a rototiller and you turn it on and you follow it behind and you chop up the soil and loosen it all again. Used to be seen as the thing to do. But the science on this has changed some because you might be thinking about all of that soil life that I just told you about. Well, what do you think happens if you get out there and you dig it and you flip it all around, or you're getting there with a rototiller and you're shredding it all up? You're damaging it. Some of the things literally will shred or die. Some of them are very sensitive to how close to the soil surface they're living. And so flipping it all over causes disturbance. And so generally the thing to do these days is thought to be the first season, the first time you set up your bed, whether it's reloosening and adding soil into raised beds or whether it's digging beds in the ground. You do plenty of loosening, digging, do everything you can to make sure your soil has lots of kind of organic matter or compost mixed all the way through, that the soil is loose. But then after that, you avoid stepping on it. And if you do that, you never need to dig it again. If you add a little bit more compost in between seasons, which is good, you can just apply half an inch or an inch of compost right on the top of the soil. The soil critters, the earthworms over time, they'll bring that down. They'll do the work for you. As long as you don't compact it, you don't step on it a bunch, you don't need to do all that work in between each season. Your fertilizer, when you put down your fertilizer, you can just scratch it into the soil just a little bit, mix it in with like a gloved hand or a little scratching tool, but you don't need to dig and flip and do all of that stuff, which makes it a lot less work. And so here is an example of when I was setting up a bed in the backyard of a place I was renting. Uh, we did have a number of weeds. It was kind of a weedy back area. And so for the pathways, cardboard boxes. I don't remember how I knew someone that worked at a food bank. And so they went through lots of produce boxes. And so I would get them from him just to keep them out of going into the waste stream, and use that as my temporary weed barrier that would later be covered with wood chip mulch. Here was my bed. So started with natural soil and then put down about 2 inches, 2 to 3 inches. I would even go up to 4 if you have access to it the first year. And then after that, when you add stuff to the top, just about an inch or half an inch, depending on how much you can get. But this was 2 or 3 inches. That's what I could get of compost. I raked it out kind of evenly. And then that first year, I did dig, and I will do the same thing in a raised bed as well, just like this. I put my raised bed soil in, then I add some extra compost, and then dig. If you're going to be doing a lot of gardening, you can get something. You usually can't find them anymore in local stores. You might need to order it online, called the digging fork, which is a little bit more efficient than using a shovel, but you can totally just use a pointed shovel or a spade to do it as well. And digging. And so normally what you do is, you spread the compost evenly, you dig in, and then you don't want to just flip it over. So keeping your back straight, working with your legs, you kind of lift it up. And so now you're lifting up almost a foot depth of soil from that area, as well as the compost. And then you kind of shake it so that it falls down in kind of a mix. And if you have clods, those clods will come to the top as you do that. And you don't need to break up every single clod. And most of the time in Ontario, you won't even have that many clods because your soil is so sandy loam. There's some clay in the soil here in this yard. But if you have clods, you can kind of rake them out. Here, sometimes you'll find things like little chunks of asphalt. Who knows how they got there? You can get rid of them. But if you have clods, what you would do is with a hard tooth landscape rake, which is worth having. You can even use the back of a shovel if you don't have a rake. You kind of just break up the clods. You don't need to get like every little tiny, you don't need to turn it to powder, but you can kind of see before and after. And then again, you'll never have to do this again if you're not digging anymore. The clods will sort of loosen out over time in the soil as life comes back to the soil. And then you're just adding a little bit of compost over time. So you do that, and then you kind of rake it out. And then here, first year, there you go. Vegetable garden. We have our walkway, and then we planted a whole variety of native plants to bring pollinators around it. And that's just kind of the basic process of getting things started. Eventually, we put in an irrigation system here, but for the first year, just watered it with a hose attachment. And so here we had, this is actually early spring. And so we have very mature, cool season crops of chard and kale. And then our young zucchini starting to grow in. And so here's some tips for raised beds if you're going to be working with raised beds and bringing in your soil. Because your natural soil is so great in Ontario, if you have extra soil from a project, you can use that and mix in maybe about 1/3 compost. So for example, my parents live in an area of the San Fernando Valley where the soil is almost identical to Ontario soils. It's great. And so when I redid their parkway, their little planting strip along the street in their front yard, we took out the lawn and then we planted native plants. Because the soil was a little bit high there, we ended up with a bunch of extra soil. We just took that soil, put it in the raised bed, and added about 30% compost, and it was great. It was better than any soil we could have brought in from a soil yard. If you are needing to be bringing in soil from a soil yard, what I recommend is starting with, most soil yards will produce a mix that's 50% actual soil, 50% actual compost. That's way more compost than you would try to mix in if you were actually growing in the ground. But just the minute details of the dynamics of growing in a raised bed and then the soil quality that they have access to just works out. You'll just have to trust me that it's better to do that. I've tried all sorts of different mixes. This is what just works the best when you're buying it from a soil yard. And I'll say not an official recommendation. But just practically, people ask, where do I get it around here? There is a company in Chino called OF Wolfenbarger, which is the main soil yard that serves this area. And for raised beds, they have something that's called a special mix, which is 50% soil and 50% kind of their nicer compost. And that's generally what I would use. And to fill raised beds, it can take quite a bit of compost. So I think they'd sell it to you in a bag, but you probably don't want to do that. To fill a standard 8x4 raised bed, it actually adds up to almost as much soil as it would take to fill the bed of a pickup truck. So if you have your own pickup truck, you can go there, they'll load you up with a tractor. But if you don't, you probably are going to need to be talking to them about delivering it. And that can be a little bit expensive. It might also be cheaper to just like rent a pickup truck from Home Depot or U-Haul for a couple hours and pick it up and then shovel it out. And you'll need a wheelbarrow as well, probably to move it. So you want to start with that, add a couple of inches of the best compost you can get your hands on, and then mix it in kind of in the same way. And again, if you have gophers, then you can use that hardware cloth you can get at the hardware store at the bottom, and you can attach that to the bottom of the raised bed, and then the gophers won't be able to get up. Some of the smaller, deeper roots they might be able to chew at, but they won't be able to kind of decimate your plant. Where I oftentimes see people go wrong with raised beds is that especially if you go to the hardware store or like the plant nursery, they don't sell true soil. You need to go to like a soil yard to get one of those mixes with real soil. And so people will build a raised bed, and then they will go to Home Depot, Lowe's, Armstrong, and they will get something that's packaged like it is soil. And so you might see something like this on the left. You might see something like this on the right, raised bed and potting mix. And while you technically can fill a raised bed with it and it will grow all right for a year, one, it will be very expensive to fill a whole raised bed with it. And two, especially in our hot climate, this stuff is basically potting soil. So if it comes in a plastic colorful bag like this from the nursery or from the hardware store, it's basically just a slightly different formulation of potting soil. And it's all organic. There's no true mineral soil in it. It's a mixture of compost and fine wood chips and fertilizers. And when you have, that's great as a soil amendment to be mixing with real natural soil. But if you fill up your whole raised bed with it, it starts breaking down. It composts more in place. It decomposes. That's natural. And so what will happen is it might work great for a year, maybe even a couple of years. But after a couple of years, you're going to start losing volume. Like 3 years out, you'll probably have half the volume than you did before. So if you filled up a 1 foot tall raised bed, it'll probably only be filled to like 6 inches after a few years. And as it breaks down, it doesn't build structure. It actually kind of just becomes dusty as it breaks down. If you are doing kind of good organic gardening with either raised beds or in the ground beds with some actual soil, and you're adding your compost and you're not compacting it, every year your soil structure can get a little bit better over time, and it'll be okay at the beginning. But after 3 or 4 years of gardening like this and adding a little bit of compost each year, plant roots growing and then dying back over time, it's going to get better and better and better. Where when you start with this stuff, it just gets worse and worse, and then you just need to keep replacing it. So it can get very expensive over time. Tips for container gardens, if you're going to be gardening in containers. Work with the largest containers you can, especially in hot Southern California summers, but even in the winter, that's going to be the larger container, the more water it can also hold on to, and that's going to help. Make sure you have good drainage. Make sure you have enough holes on the bottom so it can hold on to water but doesn't get waterlogged. In containers, you're definitely going to need to water and fertilize more often. Water, might be every day in the summer, where in raised beds, even in our hot inland area, you generally don't need to water more than 3 times a week maximum. I've grown in hot areas, just depending on the conditions, where I only need to water twice a week. Currently at my yard in Pomona, very similar soil, like I mentioned, to Ontario. My in-ground beds, I water deeply twice a week in the summer. maybe a third time if it's like, over 100 degrees, kind of the few weeks where it's peak heat wave in the summer. My raised beds are generally 3 times a week. I water a little bit less volume, but I water more often. And then maybe an extra day, just maybe if it's a real heat wave week. Whereas container gardens might need to be every day in the summer. You're also going to need to fertilize more often, probably about once a month. How long the soil lasts in a container is going to depend on the crops you grow. If you're growing smaller plants like leafy greens, then you might just be able to, after you take out your last of the greens, they don't have a huge, robust root system. You might just be able to, loosen, kind of break up the soil some with your hands, top off with another inch or so of your potting soil and grow again. Whereas like I've grown a beautiful eggplant in a big tub, but there's so many roots that I can't really reuse that soil after it. It's all very dense and clogged with roots. So unless you're careful, growing in containers with the soil turnover, all the water, all the fertilizer can be a very expensive endeavor. And so you just need to think about, what you're going into it for. But herbs and leafy greens and salad greens can make a lot of sense in containers. Those are my go-to plants for containers. And then remember, especially for in-ground and raised beds, to plan for supporting your plants and vertical growing and invest in sturdy, good material. So for example, if you're growing tomatoes, little tomato cages or off-the-shelf kits or trellises generally don't work for plants that might be as robust and healthy as you're going to get if you're following all these techniques that I'm talking about. So I normally suggest building them. So buying things like rebar, lumber, the rolls of deer fencing, or you can also get at the hardware store the mesh for reinforcing concrete, things like bamboo, and then building your trellises. So thinking things like this, things like that, things like this, your plants are going to grow up, and the little kind of tomato cage type things are not big enough to support big, robust, healthy plants. And so remember, I don't see any questions coming in yet. So there's a lot of information to share. Hopefully that means that this all makes sense and things are going well. But I'll just keep going for now. Let me know if you have any questions. So that's going to bring us to plants themselves. So we've talked about beds some, we've talked about soil some. Now we're going to talk about the plants themselves and buying seeds and buying starts. What to look for when you're going to the nursery buying starts. First thing to note, the biggest plant is not necessarily the best. It's not a good deal. Oftentimes the biggest plants at the nursery for the size are overgrown. They've been in the pot for too long and they're not going to grow well once you transplant them. You want to look for plants that look healthy and vigorous, but are kind of smaller. They're kind of in proportion to what's above is kind of in proportion to the size of the amount of soil it's in. And don't ever buy anything bigger than like the 4-inch, or sometimes it's called a quart size. Never buy a 1-gallon tomato plant or those bigger tomato plants where they have tomatoes on them or something, and it's $15. Those things never grow well. Start small. So 4-inch or quart plants, or for the winter season, sometimes the 6-packs, the pony packs of like lettuces or kale or something like that work just fine as well. No big, larger plants. Avoid things with yellowing leaves. That means that they're nutrient deficient. And you don't want, if you're paying to put a plant in the ground, you don't want anything that's ever gone through stress or nutrient deficiency. So you can see here also like this parsley, that's looking like it's been sitting for a little too long. Just skip it. When you're talking about things that eventually are going to fruit, and this is more summer season, but as long as we're talking about it, let's cover it. Avoid things with fruit on it already. So if there's tomatoes on it already, peppers on it already, that means that it's been growing for way too long in the pot. And once it's in that phase, you put it into your garden, it's going to keep fruiting this small plant, and it won't have gotten big. It's never going to produce well. Ideally, you even want to avoid ones that have flowers on them already. Now, peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants do start flowering pretty quickly. And so if there's just a couple of flowers on them, that's fine, but remove them immediately when you get it. After you transplant it, remove them for a while until it's put on some really nice growth. If you pick it, out of the flat, pick up your pot that you might get and look at it. Look at the bottom. If there's a lot of roots coming out of the little drainage holes on the bottom, it means it's probably overgrown. There's probably circling roots in the pot. Not great. If you think the roots might be overgrown, but you're still thinking about getting it, tease that little plant out of the pot. If it's one that has the little kind of, it's like a fiber pot, you can't really do that. I generally avoid buying those anyways, because those often don't grow out super well. But if it's a plastic pot, you can carefully remove it and look. And if there's lots and lots of circling roots, don't get it. So again, here's an example. Again, these are summer crops, but here's what I have the best pictures of to show you things of what not to get. It's all the same thing applies for the winter crops. And we'll talk about which crops are for which season in a little bit. You know, the color here is off. The spotting on the leaf, the little, you know, anything that looks like it might be disease, just kind of skip it. These tomatoes are, you know, really tall. They're too tall for, you know, they're tall and skinny. That doesn't look healthy. Skip it. Sometimes at the big box hardware store, they advertise, this is grown with Miracle-Gro. Skip it. If we are having great organic soil, we don't want plants that have been, basically Miracle-Gro is like steroids. And when we take plants that have been pumped full of Miracle-Gro at the little in the production nursery and put them into our slow but steady organic garden bed, those plants are going to get stunted because it's like the juice has been cut off. If we start with plants that are more reasonably grown, they're going to do much better for us in the long run. They will still grow plenty big. We don't need to break out the Miracle-Gro. This, just to take a picture of what a healthy looking plant is, you know, I still would skip these because I wouldn't buy plants that advertise they're grown with Miracle-Gro. But this, you know, compared to these, dark, even green, healthy looking, not very tall, you know, not huge compared to the size of the plot. That's generally what you're looking for with any crop. And so where around here are you going to get healthy seeds or starts? So for a smaller casual garden, that's most of you. Generally, you're probably going to want to buy your garden seeds at a local garden store or nursery, because there are some awesome seed catalogs. But if you just have 1 or 2 raised beds, unless you're super into trying like interesting varieties, just for 1 or 2 raised beds, the shipping that it would take to just buy a few seed packets from a seed catalog can get quite expensive. I will mention my favorite places to order seed from. And if you're into trying, you know, cool different varieties, by all means, check it out. It's the places where I order from because I'm a vegetable growing nut. But for most smaller casual gardens, there are some seed companies in terms of the brand of the seed packs that are going to do better for you than others. Seed quality varies widely. Generally, I will not buy seeds at the big box hardware store because the brands are often not as good. Not always, but often the brands are not as good. And oftentimes those seeds are kept outside. Sometimes they're in the sun. That's not that great. Locally around here, there's an Armstrong Gardens in Claremont that has their seeds indoors, and they have a brand called Botanical Interests. There's lots of those seeds are good generally because we like to demonstrate what can be easily purchased locally. Those are the seeds that's the brand of seeds that we use in our demonstration garden here in Montclair. They grow well, they're high quality. There's a lot of selection. Or also at some other local nurseries, Botanical Interest, and there's also a Renee's Garden Seed. It's another kind of sometimes locally available, reputable brand. If you're thinking about ordering online, and again, you can download the slide. If you download the PDF of this presentation, but my favorite mail order, and then these days you just order online and you can get all the information online. Companies are Johnny's Selected Seed, Peaceful Valley Farm Supply. If you are into or interested in growing Asian vegetables, Kitazawa Seed Company, which is based in Oakland, but imports lots of really great Asian vegetable seeds, has a lot of really good crops. And then Wild Garden Seed is another cool one. And then if you're going to be buying starts, 4 inches or pony packs of different crops, the best sources that I've found that, often have high quality stuff. Now, again, because, things sometimes sit there, it doesn't mean every single plant there's going to be high quality. So still, check the roots. But my go-to places are the Armstrong garden center in Claremont. Glendora Gardens is a really great mom and pop nursery in Glendora. And then seasonally, the Cal Poly Pomona Farm Store can have stuff as well. Sometimes the quality can be variable for all of those, but they oftentimes, especially at the beginning of the planting season in the spring, and also kind of right now, they have really great stuff. So when you are going to be doing your planting, if you're planting seeds, basically follow the direction on the seed packet. They'll say how deep to plant the seeds. Keep the soil evenly moist until things come up. Certain plants are going to be best planted from seed. Certain plants are best transplanted. Certain plants can go either way. And again, I'll show you a reference on some slides later on in this presentation where I have all my recommendations for that. If you are going to be buying plants in pots, or even if you're going to be starting seeds in littler pots and then eventually transplanting yourself, here are my recommendations for planting. This is another thing where sometimes people have just been sticking things in the ground for years, and then I share this information with them and they make some changes that hopefully help make them more successful. So if you're going to be planting, especially for this cool season, kind of planting right now, putting in your winter garden of leafy greens, vegetables, Asian greens are things to grow now, peas. If you have a larger garden, maybe cauliflower or broccoli, when you transplant, don't do it on one of our hot days. So, if you're looking at the forecast right now, I think it's come down some, but some days are going to be in the mid 80s. Some days are going to be in like the 60s or low 70s. Do it on the cooler day. You never want to do it during like a fall heat wave that we sometimes get. Ideally, do it when it's cloudy or late in the afternoon, or super early in the morning if needed, but you don't want to do it on a warm afternoon. You want to water your plants and seeds in very, very well. And if for your transplants, you want to give them an extra little boost, you can, in a small container, you can mix some water with either some liquid kelp or sometimes fish emulsion, which is very stinky. For most people, I would just say the liquid kelp. And you can kind of do a little soil dunk. You can get liquid kelp at most nurseries and hardware stores with the garden section, and it will tell you how to dilute it in water. And you can either do a soil dunk or you can put it in a water can to give plants an extra little nutrient boost when watering them in. And then after you water your plants in, see if the soil settles at all around the root ball. And if so, kind of just grab a little handful of soil from somewhere else in the bed and make sure that root ball stays nice and kind of tucked in. Depending on the weather, it might be beneficial if you are going to get a heat wave, and this is for spring planting or for fall, and we get kind of a November heat wave. You've just planted. Depending on the weather, it could be beneficial to actually provide a little bit of part shade for a few days to help prevent transplant stress. And here's a couple of ways that I do it in my yard. We buy baking soda that we use as like a laundry additive. So we get these large, like from Smart and Final, baking soda tubs that we go through. And you can also use like a large yogurt container I've used. We cut the bottom off, and that's just a little sleeve that can go over them. It just kind of protects from the sun a little bit. It's open at the top, but it's just less direct sun, less of the day, but still enough sun for the plants to keep growing well. Or just over time, I've accumulated buying plants at nurseries, some of these flats, and we'll just put them on top. For larger individual plants, sometimes an upside down milk crate, you can do whatever you need. But sometimes that does help if you get an unexpected heat wave when your plants are young. And again, it depends on the size. We use what we have, or we just make sure things stay well watered. And you also need to do some planning for irrigation. So even if you have an automatic irrigation system or a drip system, I normally plan to water with a hose, with a hose attachment that has a nice kind of shower spray. I plan to do that at least once a day if it's a heat wave, in the morning before I go to work, and then also when I get home from work, just to make sure things stay happy, to germinate seeds, and also to get new transplants established for the first little while until I see some good growth. If you are hose watering for plants that have been well established, and for example, if you don't have like a drip irrigation system for your bed, you're continuing to water with a hose, Generally, you want to make sure that you use a hose attachment and you water the soil directly if possible, and not the leaves of your plants. One of the easiest ways to help prevent plant disease is to not soak the leaves of your plants every time you water, because that can encourage some of the fungal diseases that sometimes we have to deal with. And so here, I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but here are the slides that you would want to download and maybe even print out, or if you download the PDF, you can try to copy and paste it. A general planting guide for our area, kind of what to do every month. And so the most important takeaway for our cool season vegetable gardening is a lot of our crops that people think of most when they think of gardening, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, zucchini, those are all warm season crops. So generally you plant them in late March, early April, and they are taken out. For example, my tomatoes are already out. I still have one zucchini plant left. We just took out our tomatillos. And so it's kind of shut down time now and time to plant kind of mid-October, late October, early November at the latest, your cool season garden. That's because it's enough warmth still to get things up and going well before it does get truly cold. A lot of our cool season plants, they will grow very well after it's kind of colder, or as cold as it gets, in our area. But it can take very long for seeds to germinate if you plant them in December. So it's great to plant them mid-late October, early November. And so what are you going to be doing that time of year? All the greens, lettuces, hard to grow in the summer. Great to grow, super easy in the fall. Fall through winter is actually the easiest time to grow if you're growing the right crops. So lettuces, greens, arugula, kale, chard, beets, carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, bok choy, and garlic. Those are going to be kind of the things you will mostly grow. And then if you have a larger garden, maybe broccoli or cauliflower as well. In a smaller garden, generally wouldn't bother. And so here, if you have a standard 4-foot wide raised bed or an in-ground bed, here are all the spacings that I recommend. And you can find different recommendations for spacings in different places, but this is what I do in my own garden, kind of what I've figured out through trial and error that works very well for our local climate, and also for ease of harvest, gives plants enough space that they can become big and beautiful, doesn't cram them too close together, but it's not like so far apart as if I had like a 5-acre farm. And how I break this down for your kind of understanding is, so for example, if you have a standard raised bed that's 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, the length is between plants in rows. So for example, let's go to a winter crop, carrots. Across the bed, so across the 4 feet, I would either do basically a foot apart in between each plant across, or each row across, so that's 4, or maybe even 6 inches. So 4 or 8 rows across the bed. And then down the rows, the spacing is often closer. So for carrots, just 3 feet, just 3 inches down the rows. Some plants that are larger, like cauliflowers, 2 feet generally between the plants in the rows, and then only 2 rows across the bed because they need a lot more space. So those are just kind of a basic rundown of all the crops, no matter what season of what you would do. So how to use these together. This is going to tell you what season around here to grow which crops, when to plant them or transplant them. This is going to tell you your spacing for all the different crops. And so here basically is a rundown of how to transplant a plant. What I will actually do is I will actually go out. This is one of the in-ground beds in my backyard, and measure when I'm doing my layout. So here, this is a cauliflower being transplanted, so 2 feet apart. So we just happen, you can use anything. You can just make a mark with your finger. You can use a little rock. Because I do a lot of landscape design and layout, we have all these little sprinkler flags around. So we just use those. We have a bucket with a bunch of them in there that we just kind of reuse for marking little things. So marking them out. This is the healthy, appropriately sized cauliflower plant. Beautiful, lush growth, relatively small for the 4-inch pot, but the roots are going to be perfect. I'll show you. And so taking it out of the pot, this is dunking it in just a reused, I think, big yogurt container with that little bit of kelp, liquid kelp mixed in for that extra boost, using a trowel, digging out a hole that's going to be as deep as and just a little wider than the plant. And you can just stick the plant while it's still in the pot in there and check it out. You want to make sure that your plants are not dry when you transplant them. So even if you don't do the liquid kelp, so this is still in the 4-inch pot, you can fill up, a bucket with water and dunk the plant in and really make sure that those roots are nice and saturated. And so here you can see that little plant, it still had quite a number of roots. And this is kind of perfect because you need enough roots that the soil is not going to fall apart, it needs to hold it together, but you don't want roots that are circling and circling and circling. But even with this, I like to gently loosen the root some a little bit. So you can see here, if you just didn't loosen these roots at all, they kept growing. Sometimes if they're already growing in one direction, they'll kind of keep on growing instead of going out kind of in a natural direction. And so here, just loosening these and making sure that there's, a few breaks here and there in it so that they can grow out into the soil, loosening the bottom a little bit, because sometimes they'll get coiled up in the bottom of the pot, will help them kind of grow out in a natural direction. And then kind of a quick test. A lot of plants that you'll transplant for vegetables can actually get planted a little bit deep. Definitely true for tomatoes, definitely true for any of the what are called brassicas. So that is like bok choy, eggplant, bok choy, cauliflower, broccoli, mustard, just an extra tip. They can get planted a little bit deep, stabilizes them a little bit more. Unless you specifically know that it's good to do that, you can't go wrong by planting at the exact same level of the soil. But this one, it happens to be one where you can plant it a little bit deep. So that's what we did. And then gently, not really compacting, but gently kind of packing that soil back in that you dug out around the edges. You want to make sure that there's a wide enough hole that you can fill that back in and kind of gently pack in and make sure that there's no big air pockets is basically what you're doing. And then you water it in really well. And then you look, sometimes there were still some air pockets and the soil settled in some. And then you can just, like I mentioned, touch up with a little bit more soil. And that's basically transplanting. And so from there, you're moving into what's called your establishment period. Seeds and young seedlings need to stay consistently moist at this stage. So transplants will also need constant moisture at the beginning. Depending on the weather, that can be watering once a day, twice a day if it's a heat wave, or if we get rain or if it's overcast, even every few days. All of you come with a built-in moisture probe. It's your finger. Stick your finger in the soil, and you can know if it's moist or not. Then you know if you need to water or not. As plants grow in and establish, they're going to want deeper waterings less frequently. Unless you're growing in a container, even in the summer, they're not going to need water every day. And if the very surface of the soil after your plants are established is a little dry, stick your finger into the soil. If, an inch or two down, there's still moisture and your plants are well established, you might not need to water again yet. The exact timing is something you'll learn over time. It depends on many factors, including weather and soils. Often, even in the summer though, for in-ground beds, it's going to be a deep watering twice a week if you're truly watering nice and deeply, which is what you want to do. Train those roots to grow down, less evaporation, or 3 times a week in raised beds, like I mentioned before. And then in the winter, depending on the weather, can be even less. And so that brings us to watering. That's the next part. We kind of are getting our plants through established. And so then how are we going to deliver water? Keep it all going. You want to plan for irrigation. What's your water source going to be? Is it convenient or can it be made more so? So I always like to do my vegetable garden somewhere where I can easily get a hose there. Even if I have a drip system, like I mentioned, for transplanting, for getting my seeds going, I want to hose water. So that means either putting my bed near a hose or doing some plumbing work to make sure you have access to a hose there, which can be a big project. So something to think about. You want to be able to get there with a hose. And then are you going to be using drip? There's a couple of different approaches to drip irrigation for vegetables I'll show you. Or are you going to be watering manually with a hose with attachment? If you are going to be watering manually with a hose, invest in a decent watering wand and hose attachment. I'll show you some pictures. And if you're going to be dragging a hose all around your garden, are you going to need to strategically put some, little barriers? There's little products that are sold for kind of being hose barriers, or, in my yard, sometimes we use, logs, rock in the right place, something like that. So your hose isn't breaking other plants or breaking parts of your vegetable bed. Okay, so there was a question that just came in from Marie. I'm assuming anything we plant at this point in the season has to be a plant already, or can we still start seeds? Great question. You can totally still start seeds. Absolutely. There's still time. And definitely I would say my main thing would be for things that you would normally start seeds in the ground and not transplant, which would be things like lettuce, salad greens, arugula, maybe even some of the Asian greens like the bok choys. Carrots, you never transplant carrots. You always start carrots directly into the ground from seed. Peas, they sell peas at the nursery, but they grow so fast from seed and they actually don't transplant well that you always want to plant peas in the ground. All of those, still plenty of time to plant. You can plant them. I would plant them soon. I haven't planted those in my garden yet. We'll probably end up doing those in a week or two. Early November is just fine. Even into December through November is kind of okay, but earlier is better. For things that you would transplant, which for this season, again, I only do it if you have a larger garden, would be things like broccoli or cauliflower. If you haven't started seed already, that's probably going to be easier to buy as transplants. Also things like kale and chard, I would try to plant those soon, but you can still plant those from seed or you can transplant them. So hopefully that helps. Good question, Mary. So, okay, planning for irrigation. So we'll look at the different types of drip you can use or barriers. So we got through this slide. And so here are a couple of different approaches to drip irrigation. For most people, where if you just have 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 raised beds, and you're going to not want to be special ordering kind of special products and just want to do stuff that you can put together with parts from the local hardware store or the irrigation supply store, you might want a drip system like this. This is the style of drip system we have at the WaterWise Community Center. And if you want a good breakdown, kind of part by part, about how to put together this sort of system, we don't have the time to cover all of that in this workshop because we're talking about a lot of other things. However, we cover this style of system and also then kind of what to do with it in depth in our DIY raised bed and vegetable gardening class, which is on the YouTube page. Okay, so if you look in the chat, it's the one I mentioned before. There's a whole section that is literally, I took pictures as I was building out this exact irrigation system. And so it kind of walks you through it. This is very effective. The only thing that I don't love about it as much as like the type of drip irrigation system that I use at home, which I will show on the next slide, is that these lines are very narrow. They're only a 1/4 inch, and the fittings that put them together are also very narrow. So over time, they're a little bit more prone to clogging than the other style of drip irrigation. I will say, though, the most important thing, if you're putting together a drip irrigation system, and I talk about it in that YouTube video, is the reason why, if we're working with stuff you can just easily buy locally, I use this narrow stuff instead of the wider, more like a landscape style drip irrigation, is because the narrow stuff is the style of drip you can get where the emitters on the drip irrigation system, which are not just little holes, they're little engineered things that are in there that balance out the pressure, and they put out water at the exact same rate throughout the whole bed, which is part of why it's so efficient. You can get those with the narrow tube at a 6-inch spacing. You can also get it at a 1-inch spacing, which in my opinion is way too far apart for a good vegetable garden. The landscape drip line, the closest spacing you can get for this wider drip tube, which here is just a solid tube that we use to distribute to these narrower tubes. But in like a landscape drip line where the emitters are already in, and the wider line, the closest you can get is a 1-foot spacing, which is too much. And so I talk about in the YouTube video where exactly you can get the different parts, but that's why I use this. If you're really into it, you can use what's called T-tape, which is a more agricultural style drip irrigation. And again, you can do a 6-inch spacing still, pretty similar to the other one in terms of like the performance for, like the first few years. But this, because it's wider, it's easier to flush over time. It's less likely to get clogged. On either one of them, you always need a pressure reducer and a filter. And, yeah, this is kind of, if you have a big garden, kind of something that you might be more interested in working with. But it is in our area, since we're not a real, heavy agriculture area anymore, it's something that I, end up special ordering online. If you're interested in this style of kind of, more kind of agricultural drip irrigation, then we also have another class called Efficient Irrigation. I'm typing into the chat right now for, I think it's fruit trees and vegetable gardens. And that's also on our YouTube page. And we talk about many different approaches of kind of home productive garden irrigation, including this one. And on both of those, we also go into how long to water, how often, weather patterns, all that sort of stuff, how to know how to set it. A lot of people, if you have a drip irrigation system, it actually is easy to water because it waters slowly so the soil can absorb it all. It actually is kind of easy to water way more than you need to, and overwater and kind of like waste the water and the money. So we guide you about all of that at the end of both of those. We're not going to have really much time to get into that in this class, but that would be kind of the next phase. And I did happen to show these where this one is in the raised bed, that one's in the ground, but either of these styles of irrigation can be used either in the raised bed or in the ground. So Michelle asked a question, moved into a house that has 2 in-ground raised beds, has an irrigation system that has hoses, that has stakes that spray up water. Is that the same as drip? No, that's probably what's called micro spray irrigation, which is sometimes used for vegetable gardens. And if that's going to work well for you, or if you have that already, then that's fine. One of the biggest differences with that is that with drip irrigation, like if you look at those other workshops that I just mentioned, because drip irrigation, if you build it like at a certain style, specific specification that I walk you through, it puts out water at a very calculated rate. And so with that calculated rate, very evenly across the whole bed, with that, you can then do some math. In my guides, I do a lot of that math for you already for this area, because we're all kind of growing in the same area. And I can tell you, generally, here's how long you have to run it. With those micro sprays, it's kind of all over the place in terms of how fast and how evenly they're putting out water. So through kind of trial and error and feeling your soil and digging down a little bit, making sure the water is penetrated, you can get good results with them. I'm not going to tell you you need to tear them out, but in terms of me recommending a system and then providing guidance kind of remotely, like over a class, it's kind of more hit and miss. So I can't really do that consistently. And then the other option is, if you are going to want to spend a lot of time in your garden, you can just water everything with a hose. So here's an example of a kind of awkwardly shaped deep bed. It's not the most ergonomic to work with, but this was, you can tell when I visited this garden that the person really loved their garden, spent a lot of time on it, and looked like most of it, everything was watered by hand. And that's okay too. Takes a lot more time investment though than just knowing how long to turn your drip irrigation system on, and then either having an automatic valve do it or just needing to turn the hose that feeds it on and off after a certain amount of time. So irrigation is a whole other class, but here are some general guidelines. In our area in the summer, if you have a typical 4-foot wide by 8-foot sized raised bed or that equivalent amount of planting area, so 32 square feet, roughly that. Essentially, that amount of area in the summer will require 5 gallons of water per day, evenly kind of applied to the soil surface to meet the needs of the plants. However, we don't need to water every day. 5 gallons a day wouldn't be ideal, but that's as much. So it's kind of like a bank account or a credit card that you need to pay off. You're accumulating debt and you need to pay it off. So basically, if, for example, you're watering twice per week, that's basically every 3.5 days. So when you water the twice per week in the summer, you need to put down about 17.5 gallons of water, just to give you an approximation. And again, it might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less, depending on the specifics. You always want to keep an eye on things, but that's just to give you an example. In midwinter, it's much lower. It's closer to 2 gallons a day in like February, for example. So if you are manually watering, just to kind of give you an idea, if you're hose watering, you can, with your specific hose, opening the faucet as much as you normally do with your attachment, you can see how long it takes to fill up a 5-gallon bucket of water. Maybe it takes a minute to fill up a 5-gallon bucket of water. Well, then, like in the summer, if every time you water, you need to put out 17.5 gallons into that one raised bed, then you're going to need to spend 3.5 times that much. And again, there's other ways you can do the math however you want, figure it out, but I just want to kind of give you a basic idea. If you want more guidance on irrigation, definitely check out one or both of those other workshops, and we spend way more time on it. But I didn't want to just kind of leave you hanging on that. Basically, what you'll figure out is that if you have more than a couple of raised beds, then eventually it's going to save you a lot of time to put in something like a drip irrigation system. And so this is a basic table for this would be like per typical 4x8 raised bed in the different months of the year for basically pretty consistently the weather we get. Again, heat wave week might be more, but pretty consistently for the weather we get in our local area. This first column, outside of kind of the other workshop, is not going to make much sense. But basically, here it is for a 4-foot by 8-foot area of vegetable bed. If you're watering 1 day a week, here's how many gallons it would take each week. And in July, you're going to need to water more than 1 day a week. But in January, when it's cooler and if it's cloudy, you might only need to water 1 day a week, and that'd be 12 gallons per bed when you do water. If you're watering 2 days a week, maybe that's what you're doing in the ground bed in summer. For the bed that size, that's how often you need to water. 3 days a week, same thing. That's how often you need to water. So in January, you would never water 3 days a week in January unless you're like, trying to get seeds started again, and only water 4 gallons. You'd probably just water 1 day a week and water more. And again, if it rains or if you can see that it's been overcast and cloudy and the soil is still moist, you can skip it. But this is just a general guide to per 4x8 area of raised beds, how many gallons you would basically need to apply, how often. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions about that, you can let me know. And then as you're figuring that out, if you have a drip system, you might not want to turn the hose on or turn the hose bib on, or you're wondering like, how do you program it to have the valve do that? Couple of big recommendations. If you have like valves, like sprinkler valves that you're going to connect to your drip system, if you have one of those smart timers, like I mentioned, which you can get installed for free if you have a functional irrigation system currently, meet the requirements, which are pretty easy to meet, you can get installed for free through the city of Ontario. You can normally basically set your irrigation system for your July maximum, and it will be weather sensitive. And so it will automatically water less on the weeks throughout the year that are less hot. Eventually, remember, like we said, in January, you wouldn't want it to go 3 days a week. So you might need to change it. But basically, you set it for your maximum. So if you're wanting it to go 1 day a week, you set it for your maximum. 2 days a week, you still set it for your July maximum. And it will automatically water less when it's cooler than in July. And again, we talk about that way more in the other workshops. Or, and I do this too in one part of my yard, if you kind of want to keep it simpler, you're just connecting it eventually to a hose. Remember, with drip, and we talk about this in the other workshops, you do need a pressure reducer and a filter before you get to your drip. But you just kind of know, well, I'm going to want to set it to water for, half an hour, for example, but I'm not going to want to forget it. You can just use kind of an old style mechanical sprinkler timer connected to your hose bib, where you just turn it to the amount of time it will automatically shut off. For your hose watering, whether it's for seedlings or if you're going to continue to water by hand, I see so many people who use hose attachments like you see here on the right, which I do not recommend. Like the ones that have the 8 different settings and you click to each one. One of those settings is the shower setting, and it will make a stream of water that looks kind of like you can see here on the lower left. But the problem is that when you have all those different adjustments, when it's on the shower setting, it's just one little line of holes around the very edge. And the whole center of this is not putting out any water at all, which means if you're trying to water like a whole bed, instead of just like getting the soap off of your car when you're washing it, it takes a long time. Whereas a hose attachment like you see on the left still gives you that gentle shower spray, but it's all holes. So you can actually get your watering done a lot quicker. It's worth the investment. And so generally what you would want to do is get one that looks kind of like on the left, where it's the attachment with the shower spray. It's called the watering one that's like 2 feet long-ish. And then there's a little kind of valve where you can adjust, how much water is coming through, the intensity of the flow altogether. And you can get one of these for like $15-16 usually at the nursery, and they're plenty good quality. If you want to go crazy, you can get like a professional one. They'll add up to a lot more expensive. It'll last a long time. But generally, you can get one that's a lot better than this thing for not an arm and a leg. And so this is getting us kind of towards the end of the workshop, of the content. And then I'll be able to answer any questions. There's a lot of stuff. So you'll go to the nursery, you'll go to the hardware store, they'll be selling all sorts of doodads, contraptions, and gimmicks. If you are sticking to the basics, good soil, don't step on it too much, good compost, good fertilizer, planting the right crop in the right season, buying good starts, you generally don't need much of that junk. Do buy good tools that will last when you care for them. So if it works in your budget, don't get the cheapest stuff. With tools, you often do get what you pay for. You don't need to get the super expensive ones, but get something decent. And then don't leave it out in the weather. Don't leave it out in the rain. Put it in the garage, put it in the tool shed when you're done with it. Keep the metal parts clean. Buy building material for making practical trellises, things like that. Buy a decent watering wand and nozzle. Good quality garden hoses. And don't buy those little tomato cages, any gimmicky garden junk, or those adjustable multi-click watering nozzles. Most of that stuff does not work. And so your seasonal jobs are going to be in between seasons, in between planting. And I normally will do this in between my winter and fall season, and again, in between my fall and winter. In between my cool season, like when I'm planting in the fall. And then I will also do all of this, if I can, when I'm planting in the spring. You want to keep your soil improving by adding a little bit of compost on the top of the soil, supporting your good soil guys in between seasons. You keep up constantly with your weeding and your organic pest control. Uh, Look up information online. I'll share a link at the end and some information about organic pest control. If you get out the poisons, which the nurseries sell plenty of them, you often kill as many good insects that are helping eat your pest insects than you do bad insects. And you don't necessarily want to be spraying that stuff on your food. Maintain your fertility with organic fertilizer as needed. And then plant, maintain, and harvest on time to have the highest quality production with the least amount of work. And take notes as you go. Which crops do well for you? Which crops don't do well? What time did you plant? What time of year did you plant? What month and things? And if you have a little garden journal, not only is it kind of fun to look back on, but you'll remember sometimes, when I didn't used to do this, it'd be like it's a year later and I'm thinking, oh, there was that one really, really good variety of carrot that I grew. What was that? You might not remember. If you just take a minute to write it down, you'll remember. And then the most important thing is don't get frustrated and enjoy and learn from the process. If you do this, even if you're really trying to grow some nice veggies, if you do it also with a sense of curiosity, every single year, I like to grow a whole variety of different things because every single year, even with doing everything right, in terms of just like, the things you learn about and do them right. I've read so many books learning from people with more experience than I have about vegetable gardening and farming. And every single year, something goes wrong with one crop. There's a little critter, little bug or something like that. But if you grow a variety of crops, that's okay because you have a lot of other stuff that does well. And then the next year, something else will change. And so there's, it's never perfect, but you have fun, you have, curiosity, you're going to kind of pay your taxes back to the nature and the wild world. And then you do get a lot of good food usually. And so I'm going to show you, for those of you who want to download the slides, there's a bunch of other information that I knew we weren't going to have time to really cover, but I wanted to share with you. And so the slides at the end of this, or what will be the pages on the PDF file, I go through one by one my top recommended homegrown cool season vegetables, and with notes about whether or not to plant it directly from seeds or to transplant it. And so you can see it goes through crop by crop, and then tips about each crop. So carrots, tips about carrots. Lettuce, tips about lettuce. Kale, tips about kale. Peas, radishes, chard, mustard, garlic, beets, cilantro, parsley. And then for small gardens, I also mentioned here are some things that I recommend kind of skipping in our area if you don't have a huge amount of space. If you're really into trying to grow these, then go for it. I also have some stuff talking about integrated pest management, which is not just breaking out the poisons, but thinking about what to do. So some notes about if you have multiple beds that you can grow in, kind of rotating your crops in different groups, not growing the same groups of plants in the same bed year after year. Here's a link with lots of good information about pest control that's put together by University of California, which has a lot of non and less toxic options. And then here is for the pests that sometimes show up in gardens in our area. Here are non-toxic options of what I will normally do to control them. Also some pictures of just different kind of homegrown ways of, especially for young seedlings that can get easily eaten back by birds or critters, different things that do. And then also some pictures of some good and bad bugs to help you with identification. So ladybugs are good guys. They eat aphids. Most people don't know this. These little things, which look kind of crazy, these are baby ladybugs. They eat a lot of our pest insects. So some other things to share, helping you identify some of the pest insects as well. And top sources to learn more. Some of these are like the seed companies I mentioned, but they have a lot of great information, downloads, and videos on their websites as well, with great information about growing vegetables. And so that gets us to the end of the workshop. I have just some links from some other stuff from our organization here. I have plenty of time now. It's almost 8 o'clock. I still have plenty of time to answer questions if there are more questions. But what I wanted to do for those of you who will need to leave right at 8 is I have a very quick closing poll that I am hoping that you can please quickly fill out, which lets us know how we did. And I also really, really value comments in the chat. If there's anything that you learned tonight that you feel was particularly useful or is going to help you, I'd love to know, because when I teach this next time, I'll make sure I continue to teach that. If there's anything you were hoping to learn tonight that you didn't get out of it, or anything that wasn't clear, I'd also love to know, because I'm always trying to do a better job. And other than that, yeah, if you could please quickly fill out the poll, I would really appreciate it. And then I will start answering questions. For those of you who need to leave, I just want to say thank you again for joining us from me and the Waterwise Community Center. I hope you come check out our garden at our headquarters garden in Montclair, and check out some of our other resources, as well as from the City of Ontario, who organized this event and invited me to present this. And so, no, we don't have any questions that have come in on the Q&A. I see Trang, you raised your hand. Oh, you have to go. So I will click to allow you to talk if you do want to try to ask a quick question, but if you have to go, totally get it. And if there are no questions, I will just say good night and thank you for joining us. But I will also hang out for a few more minutes just in case any questions come in. But yeah, if not, thanks again for joining us this evening, and have a good rest of your night.